Well, looks like it's going to be a big day. I got some shiny parts on the front of this truck by the time it's over with. So I'm going to get started on the install, probably talk about a few things as we go along step by step, but not necessarily film every single bolt going in, because I got to admit, that'd be pretty boring to watch. Maybe do it in fast forward. So let's get this thing rolling. We're probably on pro tip number 5 for a video series on building tonk. Short for honky tonk, that's what's up. So one of the things to keep in mind anytime you're putting a fastener in like an engine block or cylinder head, if that's not a blind hole, which means it's open on the other end and it's open into the block, whether that's just open air area like the lifter galley with oil vapor, or like oftentimes running into installing a water pump, there's coolant behind there. So use some form of thread locker, or like honestly you could use the RTV sealant, since I'll be using that anyway to coat both sides of the water pump gasket. So you might as well put some on the threads of the bolt that's going to hold that water pump on. Keep that coolant, because it will flow right up that bolt and out the head along at the end of the fastener. And that's no good to find out once you're finished doing all this entire install. Also, keep razor blades handy, so I'll use those. I taped these up when I painted the block, so I'm pretty sure when I take them off, some residual glue is going to be there. You can use acetone or lacquer thinner or something like that to clean it up. And this stuff's pretty inexpensive. It's assembly lube. Didn't have to use assembly lube, but if you're putting an engine together, you're going to need it for something else. I like to use it on bolts in order to that maybe are in a blind hole, don't have any fuel, oil, or coolant behind them, to give you a true torque reading when you go to tighten things down. So you don't want the resistance of metal on metal to falsify what your torque spec is whenever you're fastening things down. So anyway, first tip of the day. Next tip, always a good idea to chase the threads on anything before you start running your fasteners in for install. It could be a burr in there, a little bit of rust. It could be silicone in there from the last bolt that was put in correctly. So you want to clean that out before you've got a whole bunch of parts holding up and trying to get those fasteners to work. And you can see kind of some of the stuff that was pressed out. I actually saw liquid squeeze out a little bit in the back side of those top bolts, whereas the bottom one is open into the block for coolant on both sides. Actually, that one's blind, so only this one is open. So that's the number one concern of putting a sealant of some type on those threads. Alright, so I know I mentioned it in another video about for the Envision Dash about test fitting your parts. So water pump, I did test fit, at least hold it up there. It's a small block Chevy, they're pretty standard. On this alternator, you could clock this in different directions in order to get better access to your charge cord. And also we have a ground strap that we're going to have to make up to go from this fastener to the engine block somewhere. And then all the other thing we're concerned about is, oh my gosh, this post. Pretty tight in here. I mean, it barely squeezes between the bracket and the head. So I should probably go ahead and install that ground strap, at least on the head, before I get too overzealous. But I'm going to like this because it'll make my charge line be real close to where this needs to be, and I won't have extra wiring going all different directions. So I'll get that installed now. Turned out looking pretty good. Got the ground wire here from the head, makes a small loop and ties into this strap. It stays nice and neat too, not really visible. That next AC compressor is pretty simple. Top and bottom bolts and threads are in them, so no nuts required. Next up is our tensioner pulley. It's a cap screw, 3-inch, nut on the back side. And of course it has locators built into it, so different sizes even here. Let's correlate to the different sizes here, which makes it pretty simple. This is actually threaded where it fastens in, so I'm assuming that installing a nylock nut on the back side is just something to keep it from backing out. Our last two things we got is the power steering pump, which this is a remote mount recommended by the guys at CVF. I appreciate that because they said you kind of run out of room right here. If this is mounted, you can't really get to hold the tank here right next to the frame, and then the hoses connect directly. I'm sorry, you can't see that. And then the hoses have to connect here to the gearbox. It just doesn't leave a lot of space to build your lines, which these do require you to build custom lines for them, so we'll probably end up having to get AN fittings and adapters and then make up our hoses for the right length and the right angled fittings. Also, we'll be building our lines for the air conditioner system, which is again the old air system. Old air products is what we're using in the truck, but we went ahead and just used the CVF kit compressor because it fits so well and it looks really nice and it's chrome. So we were able to ask the good folks at Old Air Products when we ordered that kit to give us an AC delete. Otherwise you're buying it twice, which makes no sense at all. You'll never get that money back selling it secondhand. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and bolt up this power steering pump, also the idler pulley which goes here, and from then we will start installing the rest of the pulleys. I'll probably change out the Alternator V-belt pulley, which it came with from CVF, to the 8-rib pulley. Once we get the belt installed, then we can start putting the covers on. So that's another pro tip. Don't put your dress-up stuff on until you make sure all the mechanical stuff fits. Also, on the little pulley covers and dress-up stuff, they use some pretty small hardware to hold those. So always, anytime you're fastening something on that's going to be spinning, I like to use a blue thread locker. I almost said Loctite, which now I said Loctite. But Loctite's a brand, not a product. So we're going to have to call an audible here. According to the image on the instructions, this power steering pump would mount here, although that leaves almost no room for that fitting, and that's like a -10 AN fitting if I'm not mistaken, but it's large. There is no room to put any kind of an angle to avoid this frame, and I'm certainly not wanting to notch the frame out just to run this pump in this direction. There's, however, an option to rotate it and run it this direction, which leaves the large fitting going down and back somewhat, but that's not a problem. I've got plenty of room to bring it down and back up to the reservoir, or down and around to the gearbox. This one is a much smaller fitting, so it's a lot easier to get that bend, and it can come around and do whatever it needs to do as well. Alright, so you'll notice I've intentionally left off the fancy cover over this idler pulley to kind of get rid of the lip to allow the belt to slide on easier. The instructions mention that you may not have enough space in this tensioner to allow the belts to climb over one of the ribs on the outside of these pulleys. So just makes sense to me, leave this cover off and that'll allow us to slide on rather easily. Well, that was easy. Had to take a minute and do a quick smoke break. Haha. Let's see how we're doing here. Oh yeah, okay. Remember, if you're looking, you ain't cooking. Now back to the garage. Now through the magic of editing, I'll go ahead, since the belt's on, and install all the dress-up covers on the front of these pulleys. There you have it, all beautiful. So we've got all the bracketry done. All the fancy little covers are on it. Again, we use blue Loctite on all the small fasteners that hold these covers. Just keep it nice. Looks really good. Belt's nice and tight. Also, made the call and went ahead and plugged the top of the water pump. This is typically for a bypass if you don't run a heater. And then plumbed in the heater fitting here, which will go out to into the heater core in the Old Air Products heater core there. So I'll need to get a 90 to come out here and feed the input side of the heater core. I also went ahead and installed this temp sensor in the opposite side of this port. I thought it looked clean enough, and that will run to the Envision dash to give that temperature reading. Also still need to install the oil pressure sender there, so only 2 wires will come through for that Envision dash. All the other wiring is finished, and then I'll put a ring connector here for the charge line, and then a ring connector of course for the temp sensor. That charge line just goes around and is tied onto the positive battery post line on the starter. So that's how it gets its charge. I mean, some folks will run that line directly to the battery, but to me it just keeps it cleaner to just run it around the back and drop it down on the back side of the engine. So that's how it looks all installed. Of course, we still have to do the remote mount reservoir, which will require us to install the radiator support, which is kind of ready to go there. It has the condenser and the radiator and the fan installed, and I do have the kit from Summit. It's a painless wiring kit for the temperature relay for the fan, sorry. And we're going to run a trinary switch that we ordered with our Old Air Products system. Quick explanation on that. Typically your fans will come on at a temperature, which the Holley sniper system on this build will control that temperature wise. I want to say the default, which is programmable, but the default is I think on at 180, off at 190, but I can make those changes because you want to kind of correlate that to what the thermostat is. Also, so that would just be a simple switch on the temperature, but because we're running an air conditioning system as well, when the wire comes and creates a ground for the compressor to engage the clutch, that will also override whatever temperature the engine happens to be and tell the fan to come on regardless, because the fan's going to have to turn anytime the compressor is doing its job, even for defrost if it's not cold. You have to dry the air, which is what defrost is, right? And the only way to do that is through the compressor, evaporator, et cetera, in the AC system. So I appreciate you guys watching. We'll see you in the next one.